Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Fools and Sages. So let's see. By way of introduction to this episode, um, this is got a lot of interesting and good stuff in here. So bear with me. Uh, in spite of myself, we're back with Heidegger a little bit. But the question was about what is it? What do Judeo-Christian values mean, and what's going on with that term Judeo-Christian values, and we get into value systems and some of how these systems evolve over time, and we bounce around a little bit why Heidegger or possible explanations for why Heidegger might have been a Nazi as an example of somebody who's supposed to be a penetrating thinker who ended up tangled in what he called eine große Dummheit, a big stupidity, a big dumbness. And we kind of sort through that, and we end up with a term that Heidegger actually swiped. And he swiped it from the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart. When we're just handed value systems, we often are just given these systems, and we don't have the experience that that puts them in their place, so to speak, that translates them to us in a way that we get their real import. And which means this is kind of in that trusting others category. And so we end up with the question, basically, are there things that can be revealed just by looking in a different way? And this, again, is one of my one-string banjo songs between propositional knowledge and dispositional knowledge. But in this case, it's this way that Heidegger borrowed from Eckhart called Gelassenheit. And I mention it as one of the German philosophy words for the episode. And to explain Eckhart and his Gelassenheit, this is just straight out of Google's AI. Meister Eckhart taught that Gelassenheit, releasement, letting go, is the essential spiritual path to unity with God. Remember, Heidegger was a Jesuit, although he never mentions God in his work, Being in Time, or you could say being with a capital B is his way he smuggled God in there. But this Gelassenheit comes from Meister Eckhart, who might well have been considered a heretic. But anyway, this Gelassenheit is the essential spiritual path to unity with God, requiring the surrender of one's own will, selfish attachments, and even preconceived notions of God. It's a state of inner emptiness, quietude, and detachment that allows the divine to work within the soul. Key aspects of Eckhart's Gelassenheit include letting go of self and will. The core practice involves abandoning one's own will, Eigenwille, and selfish desires to become completely open to God. Letting be, Gelassenheit, this means abandoning all striving and, quote, white-knuckled claims upon the world, unquote, to live in a state of calm and quiet detachment. Detachment from images and concepts. This is this is propositional knowledge, transferred as proposition, but he's referring to a dispositional shift here. Detachment from images and concepts. Eckhart advised stripping away all mental images and concepts of God as true, imageless, and unmediated union with the divine lies beyond intellectualization. Equanimity in all things. It involves accepting all experiences, both good and bad, equally, rather than being fussy or selective about circumstances. Inner stillness. It is the state of the pure, clear one in the soul, where one exists as they were before they were created, allowing God to act through them. And living without a why, a central concept where one acts out of love alone, not for reward, purpose, or selfish motivation. Gelassenheit is not passive inaction, but an active, engaged state of living in the world without being controlled by it. And so that's what AI has. I'm sure Meister Eckhart would go, but anyway, that's sort of at the core, I think, of this idea of dispositional shifts revealing things to us. And we sort of look at how traditions have worked with that. And when they move away from that and things start getting passed on word of mouth, maybe some things don't make the kind of direct sense that they did in the beginning of the tradition. And so anyway, this is on the topic. This episode is allowing being to be. Gelassenheit. Enjoy.
I wanted to talk to you about this phrase that gets used a lot. And I started thinking, I'm not even sure exactly what it means. And that phrase is Judeo-Christian values. And when I unpack that, which it will be a less sophisticated unpacking than yours, I'm sure, I start wondering, well, which part is Judeo and which part is Christian? And of the Abrahamic religions, it seems to stand out that Islam is not part of that phrase often. And I don't think I understand Islam well enough to know uh, exactly why not. Although I have beliefs about that, that I've maybe picked up culturally over the years. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what Judeo-Christian values mean and where they come from, or where we see that idea living. Maybe is it should be
Yeah.
obvious where they come from.
You know what it makes me think of? How does that go? King Philip, uh, kingdom, phylum, genus,
Oh,
species. What's the
taxonomy.
rhyme?
Yeah.
What's the rhyme for that?
Nope.
I just want to, people will know that.
A
Google this or
mnemonic.
Grok,
Mnemonic
and it'll
device.
know that.
Yeah.
Pardon? Yeah, the mnemonic. And because you have, what are these things really? And it's a taxonomy, what we call a taxonomy. And I don't have it at the tip of my tongue, but I'm sure there's some fun etymological roots to the word taxonomy. But what you get with that is a gradation of levels of relatedness. Yeah. So typically what we've got is a tree with branches is the simplest image. And so what that means is that we typically see the leaves. We typically don't see the branches. Start with any leaf and trace it to the twig it lives on, trace that twig to the larger branch, et cetera, and you will start joining things that have a commonality with other leaves. And the farther down you go, the more commonality with more leaves, because more branching in has come, right? Now, of course, this is abstract because the tree didn't happen that way. The tree happened, in fact, exactly the opposite way. And that's what we see. And I've mentioned about this in all your generic, the difference between modern franchise religions and the way traditional religions seem to work. And that is that things start with a root and then they bifurcate. This is what evolution does too, right? It explores and expands into the allotted territory. And it seems like a similar thing has gone on. So when we say Judeo-Christian, you're picking a place like genus. And so where does that stop to be meaningful? At the species and variety levels. Where is it meaningful? at the kingdom and the phylum levels, I would say that I'm not a great expert on Islam, although I have read parts of the Quran. I haven't read the whole Quran. I've read parts of the Hadith, uh, which is kind of the relationship between the Quran and the Hadith is sort of speaks to what I'm talking about, and we see it in other things. I often refer to this in the Sun Tzu, and that is that you have one core doctrine. And then as it moves through time, the understanding of the elements of it get refined and differentiated. So with the Sun Tzu, you have the main doctrine of the Sun Tzu, and then generation by generation, you have different generals that maybe they have an example of that principle and how it applied in history, and they'll throw that in. Or they'll have a refinement in the understanding of what he really meant by this one term. Basically, there's a refinement. And so what happens is you get a spectrum of interpretations, right? A hermeneutical rainbow, if we were, that are kind of like, and I, of course, am somebody that wants to explore all the branches of the tree to get to know the shape of the bush. But typically, that's not something that people do. Typically, people are kind of stuck on a leaf, and maybe they go from one leaf to another leaf. But it's always been very interesting to me. I want to move to the branch, to the main branch, to finally the trunk, to finally the root. And with religion, what is that? It's religious experience, right?
We I wanna go to that and kind of I think we talked about this a little bit in our last episode too, and the commonality of spiritual experience, all the roads leading to the top of the mountain, but really they can be quite different. But before we do that, um, another angle on my original question, which I wanna push on a little more first, is, when Jonathan Sacks was debating Richard Dawkins about, the value of religion, basically. Um, Dawkins said that he was a cultural Christian, and Sachs said something along the lines of, "Well, there are Christian atheists and Jewish atheists, and those are quite different." And so that implied to me that the value systems that Judaism and Christianity represent are different. And when we say Judeo-Christian values, we're kind of mushing those together. Part of what's confusing about it to me, by the way, is that as as far as I understand it, Jesus was not a Palestinian nor a Muslim. He was a Jew and maybe a rabbi, and he was, uh, you know, um, he was living and espousing, I think, Jewish understanding in the New Testament. And then what happened after that with what he said and what he did is where the Christian values kind of get
Right.
added onto the Jewish values. But I'm sure there are other ways of looking at that.
Yeah.
So
Right.
what
Well, one of the things that I wanted to mention is that I do think that Islam fits in there on that tree because Abraham and Moses and Jesus, they all show up in the Quran, to be clear about that. It's another that you really see how these are like sister lineages because a lot of the cast members are the same.
although the
Uh,
stories differ somewhat
the
about those
story,
people.
absolutely. This is hermeneutical, though, isn't it? Um, and a lot of our hermeneutics is based on that big picture, right? Which is based on where her foot was nailed down, and that shows you that these teachings have to find a way to take root within the culture that they're trying to survive in, and none of them do that without mutating to the niche. And so, but the discussion, and maybe this is just because I'm reading I'm rereading now for our audio bookshelf, little word from our sponsor, Creative Evolution by Henri Bergson. And one of our regular listeners will know that one of the intellectual impulses that I typically try to point to is the impulse to what I say to thingify. Bergson talks about that a lot, that we want to do freeze frame. And he argued with Einstein about time. So, and this is something that shows up later in Heidegger. And it has to do with what is our lived experience of time. And it has to do with duration, existing in duration, right? So anyway, what he's always talking about is we want to see things statically that are actually in evolution. So when I hear a question like, he says we're programmed to solids because we're meant to make stuff out of solids, and things are more liquid at times than our solid sensibilities lend us an impulse to translate. And
Sometimes I just have to say, sometimes things are even more gaseous even.
at times, yep, yep, and you're lucky if the gases aren't explosive,
And
and
if you're not being hoisted by them.
exactly. And so what I would say is like the question of, is religion useful? Was that what it was with Dawkins?
Look it up, but yeah.
Because, one poses that as if religion was a single thing, and as I've expressed before, any successful religion has to exist across a spectrum that corresponds to the spectrum of human
But
psychology and
I
development.
think I think
Yeah.
to have Dawkins participate, the question has to be that flattened because his
Uh,
understanding of religion is, well, was Jesus actually resurrected or not? What do you believe?
yeah,
And
materialists have hard times
yeah, and
understanding
he
non-materialist traditions. Gee, why would they? Yeah. And see, and that's similar when people say, "Well, do you believe in God?" Honestly, my answer, if I'm answering honestly, I have to sort of do an estimation of what they mean by that term. And I can tell you with almost 100% certainty, I don't believe in the way they fill that term in.
right.
So as far as their God is concerned, no, I'm not likely to believe in what you think when you think God. Have I had my own personal set of experiences that I associate with what other people might mean when they think God? And is there a form of multiple triangulation that you can do to point to a zone of things? That's about as close as I would get. And to that, I would say, kinda. Can I hedge it any more than that?
I think Peterson's answer is good. Like, I'll just behave as though God exists, and I don't have to decide. But there's sure a lot of interesting material,
Yeah. Yeah.
internally
Well,
and
that's
externally.
pragmatic. That's the pragmatist view. And I don't think it has to happen from that Pascalian wager. I think that's, again, a little materialist to take seriously. This is, again, well, it has to do with you're talking about an abstraction. If you don't have an experience, or if you can't translate your normal experience, if you can't get out of that a transcendent that you actually can be internally objective about. How's that for a term? Uh, that is, one has a certain
Like, you have the
circumspection to
observer
realize
turned on.
you're not lying to yourself.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, then maybe you can get out of that trap. But again, this is that problem of dispositional propositional. It's like, bro, I can't get you something that requires a dispositional shift to grasp. I can't give that to you propositionally. That's literally why the Zen master hits you with the stick. Because it's not, if he could just explain it to you, if it was as simple as a sutra, and they try that. And the Zen people said, yeah, sutras are good, but this stick, have you seen this stick work? To shift you, right? To shift you. And so, you know what it brings up? A philosophy, a term. We get two good German philosophy words for today. The first one is, we've made reference to before, but I didn't have the German, and I looked up the German. These come from Heidegger, of course. Uh, Geworfenheit. How's that one? Use that on your friends. Geworfen is to throw. So Geworfenheit is thrownness. And Heidegger uses it, we've referred before, with this idea that you didn't come into the story of life at chapter 1. You came in at chapter, God knows what, maybe infinity plus 1. Meaning everything was already running. The world was out there when you were thrown, when you were geworfened out into it. And so that thrownness is a way to point to the fact that we didn't choose things. We ended up somewhere and we had nothing, literally nothing that we can access. The theories of karma might push on that premise, but nothing direct that we can see that our own will issued to get us here. We were thrown. And that thrownness puts us in a sort of a condition that, whether we're talking about Heidegger or we're talking about Bergson, they both imply that there is a dispositional shift that we need to make to get in a new relationship with it. For Bergson, it was intuition. Again, this direct experience. And he went into, and they used that to attack him. Well, this is not anything real. This is just your intuition, bro. So it's really a misunderstanding of intuition. Um, but but corresponding to that, Heidegger had this great idea that's called Gelassenheit. Gelassenheit. And Gelassenheit means releasement. And it gets translated, people talk about it as meditative thinking. But a way that I'm not sure that he or it was later people described it is allowing being to be. A releasement, which points to the way in which we typically don't allow being to be. We're in a different state. And he interestingly points to one of the evidences of that different state being states of mind and moods. Which is very interesting. I can't
Those
recall.
are all constructs that aren't quite being.
Or they're aspects of being. They're things that actually reveal ontologically the connectedness that the individual human, which he calls Dasein, has to the world. It's a way that shows up that what happens in the world, it matters to you on a fundamental ontological, what it is to be, capital B level. And so that shows up as I think it's often referred to as concernful. And this is one of those terms that doesn't translate exactly because we lose all the cognitions. In German, the word I think is, well, there's two terms, Besorge and Sorge, and one is care and one is concern. And so they're clearly related, but in English, they're not cognate. So us Anglophones have to understand that there is a psychological / philosophical connection between care and concern. And the way that we relate to what happens in the world, at least the important things, is concernfully because it matters to us, to our, ongoing being. And so this is another way that, we're kind of pointing out the myth of the Cartesian separateness, the fragmented view of subjects and objects, and a kind of a just things just floating around disconnected in a Cartesian space. This sort of says that we come into existence with things mattering to us. That's why we start out crying, right? We start out with need
It
coming
kinda
from
goes
out.
to, the episode we did about, hope, will, and desire,
And
right? That those
purpose.
are kind of hope, will, and purpose, right? That those are
Yeah.
baked in,
Baked in the
initiatives that
cake.
we have. Yeah.
Mhm.
At some point, we should probably talk about why Heidegger was susceptible to Nazism, because we talk about him a lot, and it kind of I have this little voice in the back of my head that's like, "Yeah, but what happened to him?" You know, and
Yeah,
which
yeah.
isn't it doesn't mean that he didn't contribute. Um, it's obvious that he did, but
Well, there's no escaping the conclusion that he did, and the curious thing for me, because I haven't really dug into that, and I think the way to do that would be to maybe first person accounts of people that knew him and were around him, but the secondhand version of that is actually the things that we hear from Hannah Arendt, and there's another woman that I think he had a ongoing relationship with to some degree. I believe her last name was Blockman. But there were other, I mean, Levinas, and he had students that were Jewish. He had teachers that were Jewish, and it seemed like they all stuck up for him in the end.
hmm,
And he did disavow it. He called it eine große Dummheit,
okay,
a a great stupidness.
yeah,
But I still have to grasp I have yet to grasp I can think of 2 options. One is, he did say some things that would make other people gasp, like, I think he truly believed that to do philosophy right, you had to learn German. And you might get a feeling for why that is because to the degree that I've discussed him, I've mentioned more than once that, okay, this doesn't really translate out of German. In German, these two ideas are related. In English, they're not related. And they might even come from different sources in English, where in German, they all kind of sprung out of the same whatever. There's probably a German word for it, right? And so I mean, I can feel it because in trying to mine this out, I have to reach across that grasp. And I have heard people make the argument, well, you can't really understand Heidegger unless you understand German. And the translator in his footnotes almost makes that argument. And he'll tell you, okay, that's just not that didn't make it into this translation. X, Y, or whatever he refers to with these footnotes. So, and footnotes can be important in these kind of books, works. But I don't understand, back to Heidegger and his grosse Dummheit, I don't know whether he was the absent-minded professor who just wasn't in the world, and this has been my experience of intellectuals and academics, is that they often don't get at all what's going on down off of the ivory tower. And this was a guy that was an academic. He ended up, taking Husserl's seat in Freiburg. And so it could be that he lived in this bubble world, this academic classicist bubble world. If you want to get a feel for that, read Hermann Hesse's book. In German, it's called Der Glasperlenspiel, the
the glass
glass
bead
bead
game.
game.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
I
think
read
it's
it
also
ages ago. Yeah.
published by under the name Magister Ludi.
Mhm.
And you get this idea of this ossified academic structure that is its own world. And we see that phenomenon amongst ourselves today if we look with the right eyes, where some things just don't seem to translate across the bubble membrane.
Yeah,
Uh, so
like the
maybe
definition
that's
of
what went
intersect.
on with him, or maybe the power of rhetoricians and patriotism and national spirit, maybe that, propaganda was in a very interesting stage of its development during those times.
People were probably susceptible in ways that might have been surprising. Although I see people being, frighteningly susceptible to propaganda today, and I don't know that it's gotten that much more sophisticated. Um, like
Well,
how?
again, there's that spectrum of thinkers, and propaganda hits a certain part of the
Yeah.
spectrum harder than it hits the other. And that I think that's a developable immunity because propaganda always has a certain stink to it. Uh, the more subtle kind of propaganda is more like worldview propaganda, and that's why I think it's important to study philosophy because you you need to try on models and understand that all these models are built around certain insights and that life and the world is richer the more of these genuine authentic insights you can onboard onto your map your
I, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I propose that the models have trade offs, even though the brilliant people who are erecting them don't necessarily see it that way. They're trying to paint a complete picture, but in doing so, there's always a facet that um, ends up being kind of an Achilles heel.
Well, that's the nature of the situation, which we've referred to before as sitting around a phonograph record
Yeah.
and the watching the candle move on the record. It from either seat, from any of the seats at the table, if you're in the plane of the record, you see it go back and forth. But when and where back and forth start and which is back and which is forth is totally dependent on which seat at the table. So when I get up from one seat and I go over and I sit down in the other seat, the trade off is I no longer get the virtue of the perspective of sitting in the seat I left, but I gain the perspective. And the idea is I want to get enough pictures from enough seats around the table that I can generate an understanding that lifts me into that dimension above the table that looks down and understands the phenomenon in its circularity. And the argument might be that maybe it's impossible for me to physically go into that dimension and look down on the table, but with the right mental picture and enough me sampling enough seats around the table, I can actually generate the the necessity of that dimension and what the effect of that dimension would be in its ability. In other words, reason can lift me up into that dimension if I can't physically get up into that dimension through science or empiricism somehow. And and that's why we every new model is like another leg to stand on. And then there's become some dexterity. Which golf club do I pull out of the bag right about now? And I would say that the nature of this model is so much that other brain than it's so much the holistic brain rather than the fragment brain that your impulse of which club to pull out becomes quasi intuitive. And then to a certain degree, a certain amount of automaticness it engages there. Yeah, and yeah.
So, is there a difference between a Jewish atheist and a Christian atheist? And what does that mean to you?
Well, to me, it means that there's a coastline of Norway problem. Is there a problem between one Jewish atheist and another Jewish atheist? Is there a difference? I would say, yeah. Is there a difference between one Christian atheist and another Christian atheist? I would say, yeah. Because
Okay.
again,
I mean, you can
everybody's God is a different God, right?
yeah,
So the God they're not believing in will tell me
yeah,
a lot about their situation.
but but if you I I get that, and
Yeah.
there are some core ideas that differ between Judaism and Christianity, like the idea that, um, forgiveness is and we talked about this, on a
Yeah.
previous episode. We talked about forgiveness
They're
and
very different.
yeah,
Very different.
so if you live in a culture that has a different idea about forgiveness or redemption, or the importance of the afterlife compared to this life and those kinds of things, even if you don't believe in that stuff, swimming around in that soup is gonna make you different. And
Mhm. Mm.
and saying that like that two Jewish atheists are also different from one another doesn't address like what I'm asking about. Because we could say Judeo-Christian values and you paint the picture of like, yeah, that's all part of one continuum. And yes, of course. And Judeo-Christian values are also a thing. Like it's a holacracy, right? That we're describing, not just a spectrum.
Well, it's a region. I don't know that it's a thing. I think the thingness of it
A
is an
region is fine. I
abstraction.
mean, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And when you get to the edges, it might get a little mushy, but there's still a you know, like we hear that Western liberal democracies are based on Judeo-Christian values. And I think what that means is that and it's true that in the Torah there are descriptions and rules having to do with individual rights and dignity being universal, human dignity and caring for the poor and the stranger and all of that stuff became there are laws about that in the Torah and there are laws about that in the constitutions of Western liberal democracies. And so there's like a thread.
Sure.
So
Right.
I don't want to just abstract the whole thing.
No, no. Well, but what I guess what I want to say is that I don't know how dominant the values are as an influence uh
Pop culture.
compared to the chapter of development that the culture and the individual are in.
Say more.
So
Okay.
like, if people saw our conversation with Jeff Moore, one of the things that I thought his presentation of his ideas was typically within the realm of business. And one of his insights had to do with that businesses go through a life cycle, kind of like humans, or maybe more obviously like bugs do, because you've got your pupae and your larvae and everything changes from one of those stages to another. Like literally the hardware changes, maybe it lived in the water, now it's flying. It was breathing out of its butt, now it's breathing, I mean literally everything gets rearranged. And what was appropriate in one chapter is not necessarily appropriate. In fact, it could be a disaster for the next chapter. At one point, that it's real important that the chicken's eggshell, that eggshell stays strong and unbroken. And at a certain point in time, in developmental time, it's imperative that that shell break. Opposite thinking, literally opposite thinking. Why? Because it changed chapters, right? So when an individual or a society changes chapters, it will interpret everything through the lens of that chapter. If you're tribal, then whatever, I'm sure you'll find tribal Buddhism and tribal Islam and tribal Christianity and, tribal animism. and it'll have certain very similar characteristics.
Um,
And
the chapters that you're talking about, of which tribal is an example, is that on the same continuum as modern and postmodern, down that road, or is it a separate?
I think so. I think there's a lot of different maps of this. I
Yeah.
think this is probably Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, that something goes on through the story of time, through the ping pong ball back and forthness, which is his dialectic, Hegelian dialectic, that we get somewhere. His idea, I think, is that we get somewhere. The other people say, no, we just do this and it's the internal recurrence. And it's like, well, for you, for your seat, it doesn't really matter that much. You're just going to the next place. Whether you're riding around a circle track or whether you're getting somewhere. If it's a circle track, it's a big enough track that, you know, it'll seem like you're getting somewhere probably. So, that we can think about this from two different sides. Maybe that's a way to look at it. You got the inside and the outside. What are these values supposed to do? Are they supposed to lubricate society? And this came up with the rabbi also. Check out that episode if you missed it, folks. And that is, some of the things are there to support spiritual realization, and some of the things are there to support societal stabilization. And when those two are in harmony with each other, everything's fine. It's when the two opposites, when those two poles become opposites and they start to pull against each other, and there becomes a tension between them. And I think we see that story through history, and maybe that is another face of that dialectic. Uh, that's clearly what we see, these thinkers that show up in time that sort of revolutionize things. And there seems to be some of that sort of function of it becoming the antithesis of the thought before it somehow, and generating a whole new world that as a result of the synthesis of those two. And that's you just the Hegelizers, as I think William James called them, the Hegelizers. This is what they're thinking about, right? And so yeah, I mean, how does this strike an individual? Well, are you obviously you need to harmonize the inside and the outside, right? That's kind of one of the big challenges. I think we talked about that in that episode about hope, will, and purpose. Is you have the dichotomy between the inside and the outside, and you have to resolve that. And so, you obviously want to have the two mutually supportive. At least that seems intuitive to me, which is to say, I want to live. It's not intuitive to everybody. I want to live an external life in a way that supports my internal life. And maybe there's a priority there as opposed to I want to live the internal life that supports my external life. Maybe that's where you end up in the pit
Uh,
of materialism.
yeah, I was gonna say that's, it sounds materialistic.
Sounds
Um,
like the elements dominating spirit rather than spirit
right,
dominating the
exactly.
element.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's an
So
inverted pentagram. Yep.
right. So if you have an impulse to be the magician, wielding the scepter and the disc and the cup and the sword, then you'll want to keep spirit on top. Then you'll want to have your outer circumstances supporting your inner development. But if you want to be, uh, where does Peterson takes it out of Pinocchio, right? If you don't want to pay attention to your internal development, then you run along with those kids that Pinocchio ran along with, and pretty soon their ears started to grow and their tails started to grow, and they turned into donkeys,
Mhm.
right? Which means that you're just basically wearing the meat suit now. It's all about the meat suit. Oh, the meat suit's hungry now. Oh, the meat suit needs to sleep now. It's like, oh, the meat. And it's like, well, okay, that's kind of boring. Right. Uh, In some sense, it's like people that are all about their car, but they never go anywhere interesting, but they're really into the car. Listen to that.
Or even people that go interesting places, and don't have interesting
Nothing changed.
experiences,
Right,
right?
right,
Or people that have interesting experiences, but don't seem to learn anything from them. Or, I mean,
right.
there's a fractal to it. But yeah,
That's a dispositional thing, isn't it? Because one of the ways you go to these amazing places and maybe you get a little transcension out of it is that Gelassenheit, right? That allowing being to be, a releasement, a kind of an undoing, right? That's why the idea of meditation, just sitting. Uh, there's within Buddhism, you have the people that sit within Japanese Buddhism. You have the people that within Zen Japanese Buddhism. You have the people that sit looking at the wall, and you have the people that sit looking at the center of the room. And those are respectively Soto and Rinzai. And there's different theories about how that happened. And one of the theories I've heard, I have no idea if it's real, but they say that it was the wall gazers, as the Soto sect are known, uh, that they mistook the idea to sit looking at the wall, but what they really were after, what really was supposed to happen, was you want to be looking at things like the wall, which is to say that
meaning you want to look at things in the way that a wall looks at things.
impassively, like things just pass before the wall
That's a
and the
big
wall
miss.
makes it's a prepositional confusion that's yeah, but
And a or just a semantic one, like
or it's
a
just a clever
a
way.
syntax problem.
Yeah, but it's a clever way to point at a dispositional shift that we're after. And that is that there is an impassivity, a releasement, an allowing of being to be. Or, uh, in Levinas, we had this idea of totalizing and trying to totalize the other, trying to sort of capture it and put it in a box of our little pictured, world reality. And this idea of releasement it might be related to not mistaking your cognitive model for reality itself, not translating all of experience into the ready-made boxes that you've already conceived through your pre-assembled cognitive model, which is, of course, our impulse because it works very well to do what we do. But again, that impulse is to make stuff and it's focused on solids. To get what's really going on, we have to go through that. Lao Tzu said, view life without passion. What is that passion? Is another kind of that caring, that worrying about that mattering of things. Well, it's the mattering. What does it matter? It matters to me. Even if I'm worried, this was Heidegger talks about this. He gets into our relationship with others, and he talks about fearing on others' behalf. And that even when we fear on others' behalf, we're really still fearing on behalf of ourselves because of our attachment to the other, because one of the qualities of Dasein of a human is to be with. And so our condition of being with would be deprived if another person suffered harm. And but this idea is still associated with care, with a type of attachment, with a concernfulness. But this idea of Gelassenheit is releasing that attachment, releasement. So now my releasing that concernfulness with what happens and with what matters is what enables me to get up from the seat around the record player to be able to move into that new dimension through intuition, perhaps, which to Bergson is the direct experiencing of what is. Rather than having to do it from
To think
many
about it.
seats at the table and using reason to say, well, if we're all right, that must mean then,
Yeah.
you know? Because I do think that this is the idea that there's 2 paths up the mountain, and that sometimes, the masters or the pioneers get up there, and then they kind of have to drop set the fixed ropes for us to Jumar our way up there, because maybe we don't have those climbing skills to do it without a lineage or a sangha, or a guru, or, as the different accoutrements that help us get up the mountain. Um, but, like we say in martial arts, some master originally came up with this, and then he had to flatten that out into a technique to be able to give it to you. He had to somehow like pre-digest it like a mother bird and then spit it in your mouth already halfway chewed up because you're going to choke on this if you try to eat it yourself. And um, so a lot of lineages, that's, part of what they're trying to do. Let's jumpstart this. Now, I've talked about this as an as if. You don't know that this works yet, so you're going to have to start out assuming as if. And then with time, your experience will fill it in, and then you go, "Oh yeah, I guess it was."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Lao Tzu also said, um, that we have to experience the world with passion because there's a, a value in the connection or attachment. And I guess in the example that you gave, I'm confused about that because fearing for others, for example, is fearing for self, is kind of a fundamental sort of attachment that we might want to release. Um, but is that not also living with passion? I guess we're looking for both. That
Well, I think that in the term that Lao Tzu uses it, we're all born sitting at the table. We're all born seeing a particular back and forth, and maybe through ordinary effort, we can change seats and see different backs and forths, but it takes, an extraordinary effort or a transcension to get up into that third dimension to look down on the table to see the circle itself
Mhm.
spinning. No back, no forth. To
Yeah.
transcend duality. How's that? Right? But, and if we think about it, a lot of these traditions tell us the same thing. It has to do with attachment, is what the Buddhists would tell us, or it has to do with, from the Kabbalistic tradition, there was that idea of being rooted in a will to receive as opposed to being rooted in a will to bestow. One is like the creature, one is like the creator. As a parent, you understand, you get a flavor of what it's like to be the creator because when you feed your child, your impulse to feed your child is you having the will to bestow. You literally want all the best things for your child to grow up as fruitful as possible, just like the creator wants all of the nature to fruit out. And but you had to make a movement there, a dispositional movement from self to other to do that. And that's a little jump start, little pointer to what the idea of getting up out of your seat and seeing from another seat might look like. That still doesn't necessarily get you all the way up and looking down from above. That's a different kind of push-ups. But but it will start to crack the bubble of the one of the egocentric bubble world. It should. It doesn't always, I guess.
I really like the for me, it was a little bit of an aha around the difference between sorting through what you can in your external circumstance to reinforce the internal condition that you're wanting to manifest and how that differs from flipping that on its head, to influence the internal circumstance to achieve the external one that you're looking for. And I'm wondering, like, it seems like there's more meat on that bone, I guess,
Oh,
because
yeah.
because what comes up for me is that, like, um, if we, if we're really pursuing, viewing circumstances impassively as a wall, then w why do the external circumstances matter? And we've talked about, meditating when you've got the perfect temperature and there's no noise and the kids are out of the house and all of that stuff isn't the same as meditating in the midst of life itself.
Yeah.
Um, so it seems a little similar to me. So, how do we think about influencing our external circumstances without just being attached to trying to perfect them and or even optimize them for our internal circumstance? How do we know that the universe has not already done that?
Well, I guess for me, that's where martial arts showed up. It was apparent to me where, in my particular situation when I was young, it was pretty evident to me where my environment was poking and jabbing me. And it became clear that the solution to that was going to be some kind of adaptation on my part. Maybe other people would have said, well, you just need to constantly seek out authority to protect you. But that was not my impulse. It seemed pretty evident that authority wasn't going to be there all the time to protect me. Uh,
I think we're kinda getting to, like, where the fundamental arguments about attachment, at least that I've had, end up around, like, well, but there are times to act, right? And that implies attachment.
oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, as Joshu Sasaki Roshi said, the world of God is nice, but there are no bathrooms and no restaurants. And you are here in a meat suit. So the question becomes more uh, who's driving? And to come up with a nice incubus reference, do you let the fear take the wheel and steer? Uh, fear for Heidegger is a signal of that connected attachment to the outside. And so it's not a surprise that that would be one of the poisons of the mind that we would want to be able to antidote. Not that it doesn't have its place in time, uh, but, uh, one of the 5 Dhyani Buddhas, he's got the gesture of fearlessness, which is very similar to Pichuan, I always thought. Uh, but so so the idea is that you don't wanna get carried away, and you don't wanna get distracted, right? And you don't wanna get bewildered, attraction, aversion, and bewilderment, you know? So attraction is getting sucked off the path, by, luxury or, anything of a seductive nature. Aversion is getting pushed off the path, somebody this is a more obvious jab, right? Somebody's gonna instigate you, and that stimuli is gonna cause you to go off the path. So you didn't get pulled off the path, you got pushed off the path. And then there's bewilderment. Those are the three big problems: attraction, aversion, bewilderment, according to Buddhism. And bewilderment is just you're getting spun off the path by the maelstrom, that we've referred to before. And
I'm sure there's
so,
a German word for getting spun off the path.
well, yeah, it's going to be related to that Geworfenheit, right? Because you were thrown into the spin,
Yeah,
thrown into the maelstrom.
right.
So So how does one stabilize in that? Well, one of the ways is through the cultivation of philosophy. And through another way is through uh,
So
stabilizing your psychology, which is a process, right?
so both of those are internal adjustments,
Yeah.
psychology and philosophy. What do you have to say today about external environment adjustments?
Well, I mean, what are those? Those are the requirements of the meat suit. And then there's that vast gray zone between need and desire. And that's, this is one of the reasons that we've made reference to Plato before, saying the unexamined life is not worth living. Uh, One of the things you examine, as did Aristotle, and we've made reference to this also in his Nicomachean Ethics, what are the different things that people think of as the good life or as desirable? And he runs through the list. Well, wealth, power, pleasure. He goes through all these, and one by one, he explains why. See, this has got a problem because if it's influence, well, the problem with that is it's not in your control; it's in other people's control. It comes and goes on its own, so you're going to really be jerked around if that's what you're after. And the same, more or less, can be said with wealth: is that it's outside of you, and it can be there and be gone, and uh, and this is where the beginning of Stoicism comes from, because the guy who started Stoicism was not Marcus. It was a couple hundred years before Marcus. His name was Zeno. He wasn't the Zeno with paradoxes, but he was a Phoenician, and he got shipwrecked, I think. And so literally was like from doing okay to, gee, I wish I had a friggin' coconut to eat. And then when he was finally rescued or whatever, he came and would preach this philosophy that he developed from that experience under the portal. And the portal in Athens is called the Stoa. And I believe this was a place where people would typically come to have discussions. You're in the shade, you're in Greece, you're
Okay.
hanging out. So they became known as the Stoics because they're hanging out under the Stoa.
Huh,
Right.
that's fun.
So isn't
Reminds me
that a
of a
fun
joke
story?
too, the shipwrecked part in the coconut. So this ship is going by a deserted island and notices there's a guy there, and they realize it's a guy that's been lost for years. So they pull over to help him out, and they see there's three huts on the beach behind him, and they ask him, "What's that first hut there for?" And he says, "That's my house." Oh yeah, that makes sense. What's the second hut? That's where I go to church. That makes sense. What's that third hut? That's where I used to go to church.
That's good.
Apropos
Yep.
to today, I think a little bit.
Yep. Well, because our sensibilities about things change and they get updated.
Then you got to build new huts. You got to
Your
change your
worldview
external
changes.
circumstances.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And but I think that's really what it comes down to. And we talked about this in our nice episode about Ibn El Arabi, um, where everybody, because of the incapacity of humans to conceptualize God, when they think of God or direct thoughts or hopes or dreams or whatever towards God, whatever that package is that they imagine, we know it's not God, because the human mind can't do that, because the God, and this is where the list of all the attributes comes in, and every one of those attributes is beyond the human grasp in its exceeded capacity, right? And that's why those become qualities that we in our what's the way we really worship is by trying to develop these capacities within ourselves. If God is all merciful, then we need to show mercy, right? If God is beneficent, then we need to be beneficent. If God is all wise, then we need to try. Not that we're going to become as wise or as beneficent or as merciful as God, but that those become the standards of potential that our little seed of that creator dust uh, has its own little capacity of potential to expand and fulfill. And so then every experience of that is going to be different, and every interpretation of that is going to be different. And that's why I hammer on hermeneutics, and why I hammer on what you're going to get out of this is going to be based on your interpretation of it. And that's what your understanding is going to be built on. And the better your interpretation, the more you're going to get a multiplier on all the good stuff, and you're going to get an immune system to some degree against some of the bad stuff, and maybe a way to transcend some of the bad stuff if you really get wood on the ball. So, and again, this is what just gets defined as the love of wisdom. This is traditional, right? And so we've gone through all these different changes, but what does it come down to? It always comes down to you. It always comes down to what you bring out of it, right? It doesn't matter to you how smart Kant was or wasn't, or Hegel or Spinoza or any of these guys. What matters is what you can bring home and translate to your grasp of things. And that's the multiplier. That's why, that's how we avoid just circling the kiddie pool of being and fulfill some of that potential. That's the idea. Yeah. And as as to the degree that I can, with the years that I have to show, I do feel like that is the case. That it really is. This is another guy that we might have mentioned a few shows ago, Boethius. Does he ring any bells?
I don't remember that.
Boethius was thrown in jail awaiting execution. And he wrote a book called The Consolation of Philosophy.
In what part of the world and in what period of time?
He was calling her Sophia, I'm pretty sure. I want to, maybe he wrote in Latin. That'll be a quick one. What was the deal with Boethius?
Boethius was a Roman scholar.
Roman scholar, statesman,
Okay.
executed.
He wrote The Consolation of Philosophy.
He was wrongly accused of treason by the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great. Phew, talk about a bad weekend. So this was in the year 520 and change.
Got it.
And he was imprisoned after defending a fellow citizen, and then he was tortured, and then he was executed. And while he was in prison, he wrote the famous philosophical work, The Consolation of Philosophy, considered a masterpiece. He's known as the last of the Romans and the first of the scholastics, Boethius. So go out there, get you some. Um, Check him out on Wikipedia. And these are the kind of books that, honestly, you can get these books cheap because they're curiosities. And there's a lot of people that had to read them for college, and and then they sell them. So there's a lot of used volumes of these things out there. They're not like some of the authors that we've talked about. To get their books is more expensive. Copy of Levinas's work will cost you some money now. But Boethius, I'm sure there's an Oxford or a Penguin or somebody out there that's got, and you'll get a copy for $4 or something, I bet, and it'll have somebody's name in it because they had to read it for school, and they weren't interested in the consolation of philosophy. They were interested in the consolation of getting out of this class in philosophy, and which is similar but different. Not to be confused with the consolation of philosophy. And but
It's very
anyway, it's that
similar to the confusion of the wall, honestly. It's very
yeah,
similar.
very similar propositional inversion, and you're done. Yeah,
Yeah.
and but it's interesting, similar to the Stoics, in that you've got this character Epictetus, who was also a slave, but he was able to go out and attend lectures from a I can't remember the name of the guy, but he was down the lineage of this Zeno who spoke under the Stoa, and it had gone through a number of hands, and so it shows up in one side in the hands of a slave, and he finds it to be very useful, and then it shows up in the other in the hands of the emperor Marcus Aurelius, who like bent over backwards to get his hand on anything that these guys thought. So that's a kind of an interesting thing because what we were talking about was the usefulness of values across the spectrum of human experience. And so a philosophy that can be of useful use for you when you're the emperor of the world and also when you're a slave, uh, that's got some bandwidth, right? And so no, it's an interesting question there, and values they always become just getting back to the original question, they always are in some sense adaptations to the current environment in an effort to find some form of sustainability, either collectively or individually.
It
And
it sounds related to the idea of all meaning being context-based.
well, and it's relevant to today because when the context is rapidly changing in a time of hyper novelty, then things that are sort of tethered to that might start oscillating in curious ways, and we might see signs of an untetheredness. And which I think, if we were focused more in social critique and commentary, then we'd have a lot of stuff there to point to
Yeah.
that that shows up. Maybe this is all still just the repercussions of of Nietzsche's time and the death of God. Post just after the Civil War, the American Civil War, right, 1880s, something like that. And
Uh,
which has to do with this sign, and this has kind of been an interesting theme. And I want to reiterate again that I started dropping this week. It will be by the time you hear this, there'll probably be a couple up of a public domain reading of Bergson's Creative Evolution, which is back and forth this dialogue between are things, is everything determinist or is there some space for novelty and creativity within the nature of creation? Or is it all just, dominoes falling over, following the necessity given from the first domino?
I have opinions.
Yeah, me too. Well, and so have many, many great minds, and that's why they've got some interesting arguments. Uh,
I wouldn't say that's what made them great minds. I think I have to do a little more than have an opinion.
well, I was going to say their opinion is always based on some insight, and the question always becomes, from whence came these insights?
And can one articulate it? Because I think that's part of the challenge
And
too.
recreate it,
Yeah.
re-experience it, even if it's just in the rehydration of a dehydrated form.
Yeah, kinda that
Um,
partially digesting something. That's another way of saying, in some cases, being able to tell the story in a way that other people will get it, um,
if
which
our
which
hermeneutics are good, we'll get more of it.
yeah. And if you can't do that, I don't I guess I'm on the fence about whether you truly have the insight.
Well, depends on the nature of the insight. That's why I like the 10 bulls so much, because if the insight you're after is something, as I have suggested, that is fundamentally as physiological as psychological, then it's not merely a mental satori, it's actually a across those dimensions from physical to mental to psychospiritual, however you want to map that. And there's a certain definiteness to that. Uh, However we interpret it ontologically, you cannot convince yourself ontically that it didn't happen. And this is like I expect over the next weeks, we're going to work our way into William James, who's a really important part of the story, particularly as where psychology and philosophy meet, and what metaphysics and what is that distinctly American thing that sort of winds in there that shows up with James. And James, of course, is the founder of pragmatism, and he would say, well, if people live better lives because of their believing in religion, then religion's good, whether it's got, absolute truth or not. He would be all on the cash value of the idea. Um, But, uh,
Interesting.
but that's the settler way, isn't it? For the pioneer's motivated in truth, and it's that dynamic tension between the pioneer and the settler,
Mm,
maybe that pulls culture along. The pioneer being that avant-garde and, literally being the advanced frontline troops that are
yeah,
moving out into the unknown and making safe for the troops that come behind. That is what the avant-garde does, right?
yeah,
And as we know from art and from everywhere else, if the avant-garde is doing its job, it's so far out in front that it doesn't make a lot of sense to the main mass of the force. "What do
yeah,
you mean swamps? We're here in the savannah." "Yeah, well, we're 35 miles ahead of you and it turns into swamps." Um, so no, there's an interesting thing there, and that's where that two-part function of the human brain, we haven't talked about that translation to society, where there might be a right brain and a left brain to society, and where do the artists fit into that? But that might be worth another topic, another whole episode.
yeah. Cool. Um, Good. Well, maybe let's pause there and pick this up next time. Thank you, Brian. That gave me some good stuff to think about over the weekend while I'm keeping warm.
Sounds good. Too bad you don't have a fireplace in there, huh?
I know. Yeah, it'd be perfect.
I know.
Maybe I'll just dig a fire pit in the living room.
Get you a Sawzall and poke a hole through that wall, and
Yeah.
no problem. Cool. Stay warm.
Thank you. Take care.